The warm Friday evening hummed with the refined sounds of La Fontaine, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. The gentle clink of glasses, the soft glide of servers, and the distant soothing jazz from a corner piano wove an ambiance of quiet indulgence. Amidst it all moved Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress whose quiet demeanor belied an unmistakable spark in her eyes. To most patrons, she was simply part of the polished backdrop. Yet within her, aspirations soared far beyond the luxurious dining room. Serving tables was not Deborah's ultimate calling. It was a stark necessity. Her true passion lay in music. The piano, since childhood, had been her sanctuary, a place to pour out every joy, every sorrow, every unspoken thought. But dreams, she knew, offered no paychecks. Long shifts at La Fontaine were a vital stepping stone toward the prestigious music academy she yearned to attend. Few knew of her profound talent, save for the occasional colleague who caught her stealing private moments at the old upright piano in the back room during a fleeting break. That night, as the initial dinner rush began to subside, the grand oak doors swung open. In strode Leonard Grayson, instantly recognizable. The wealthy entrepreneur entered with an air of self-importance, as if he owned the very ground he walked on. Flanked by a few equally polished companions, Leonard exuded an undeniable aura of superiority. Known for his sharp wit, a biting tongue, and a penchant for public spectacle, his presence made even the most seasoned staff stand a little straighter. Deborah's colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Leonard was a notoriously difficult patron. For Deborah, however, he was simply another table to manage in a long night's work. But this evening would be far from normal. As Leonard scanned the room, his gaze landed on Deborah. Something about her seemed to catch his attention. A momentary pause, then a slow, calculating smirk. Deborah felt the uncomfortable weight of his stare, but brushed it aside, focusing instead on refilling water glasses and clearing plates. Leonard, however, was not finished. He had already decided that she would be his evening's entertainment. A cruel attempt at public humiliation was brewing, poised to shatter her composure and perhaps her spirit. Deborah's roots were humble, stretching back to a small town in South Carolina where grand ambitions often felt as distant as the constellations. Her mother, a single parent and an indefatigable caregiver, had tirelessly worked double shifts as a nurse, ensuring Deborah and her siblings always had food on the table. Despite their modest means, Melody had been a constant, comforting presence in their home. Her mother's well-loved vinyl records and an old, slightly out-of-tune piano, a generous gift from a neighbor, were the fertile ground where Deborah's deep love for music first blossomed. That piano became her sacred escape. While other children played outdoors, Deborah spent countless hours teaching herself to play. She would painstakingly mimic the popular songs on the radio, then venture into the challenging realm of classical pieces she discovered in dusty secondhand music books. Her inherent talent did not go unnoticed. She graced church services with her playing, performed at school recitals, and captivated audiences at various community events. But public recognition, however heartwarming, could not erase the formidable financial hurdles that loomed over her musical aspirations. By the time she turned 18, the harsh reality was undeniable. A professional musical career would have to wait. Scholarships, despite her gifts, proved elusive, and immediate family responsibilities took clear precedence. Deborah, with a heavy heart, packed away her concert ambitions, replacing them with the practicality of earning a living. Yet, she found she couldn't entirely relinquish the piano. It was more than a mere dream. It was an intrinsic part of her identity. When she relocated to Raleigh a few years prior, Deborah specifically sought employment at La Fontaine, drawn not just by the prospect of a steady paycheck, but by the magnificent grand piano tucked almost reverently into the restaurant's corner. Even though she rarely found a moment to play it, simply knowing it was there provided a profound sense of comfort. Music hadn't abandoned her, it was simply waiting. As Leonard Grayson and his entourage settled into their seats that evening, Deborah approached their table, balancing a tray with practiced, effortless grace. Leonard ordered a top-shelf scotch, his voice loud as he cracked a joke, ensuring nearby tables overheard. Deborah offered a polite, professional smile as she meticulously took their orders, her voice steady despite the strange, almost aggressive energy radiating from him. "Deborah, huh? Sounds like someone with many hidden abilities." The remark caught her off guard, but she merely nodded politely and moved away to place their requests. She didn't notice the knowing grin he shared with his companion, nor the way his eyes tracked her every movement. Leonard wasn't just observing her, he was planning. And Deborah would soon find herself unwillingly cast as the centerpiece of a spectacle she never solicited. The evening unfolded as it typically did, filled with the gentle hum of conversations and the soft clink of silverware. Deborah maintained her steady pace, meticulously avoiding Leonard's piercing gaze as she navigated between tables. She had handled her share of demanding customers before, but something about him felt distinctly different. Not merely discourteous, but calculating, almost predatory. His presence loomed like an oppressive shadow, creating an unease she couldn't quite articulate or shake. By the time the appetizers were served, Leonard had already commenced his peculiar performance, though not the kind Deborah had anticipated. He held court at his table, loudly recounting tales of his extravagant successes and peppering his monologue with pointed jabs about individuals he deemed lacking in ambition or drive. His entourage, a collection of sycophants, chuckled dutifully on cue, while other diners cast annoyed, wary glances in his direction. Deborah diligently attempted to remain focused on her tasks, but as she returned to his table with a freshly uncorked bottle of wine, Leonard seized his opportunity. "Tell me, Deborah," he began, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with a sharp edge, "what do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you harbors aspirations beyond this?" His words halted her mid-pour. Deborah hesitated, then offered a careful, understated answer. "I play piano, sometimes," she confessed softly, hoping to keep the discussion brief and dismissible. Leonard's eyes gleamed, and a slow, almost imperceptible smile curled across his lips. "A pianist, you say? How utterly fascinating. Why not give us a little performance then?" Deborah froze. The entire room seemed to suddenly quiet, the oppressive weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "Oh, I couldn't," she demurred quickly, forcing a nervous, brittle laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard was not about to relinquish his advantage. "Nonsense," he declared, his voice booming across the dining room, drawing the attention of countless patrons. "There's a beautiful grand piano right there in the corner. Show us your abilities. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a small audience?" His companions chuckled, clearly relishing the unfolding drama. Other diners turned their heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort, drawn to the burgeoning commotion. Deborah's chest tightened, a vice-like grip. She could feel the collective heat of their stares, the silent judgment, the anticipation of her potential humiliation. Every fiber of her being screamed to say no, to simply walk away. But Leonard's challenge hung in the air, a cruel dare, forcing her to either rise to it or crumble beneath its deliberate weight. "I really shouldn't," Deborah stammered, her gaze darting around, searching for any semblance of support, but even her colleagues seemed hesitant, unwilling to intervene. Leonard leaned back in his plush chair, slowly sipping his scotch, a picture of smug satisfaction. "Ah, I perceive," he said mockingly, his voice dripping with disdain. "Much talk, no actual talent. That's truly disappointing." The words struck Deborah like a physical slap, her hands instinctively clenched at her sides. She was not one to seek confrontation, but the way he dismissed her, reducing her to a mere joke, a nobody, cut deeper than she could have anticipated. Her mother's steadfast voice echoed in her mind. "Never let anyone diminish you, Deborah. You are greater than they will ever comprehend." A charged moment of silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Deborah glanced at the gleaming grand piano, then back at Leonard. His smug expression dared her to take the bait. And against her better judgment, fueled by a sudden defiant spark, she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady, surprisingly low and clear despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll play." The room bristled with a collective anticipation as Deborah, every step an act of both apprehension and defiance, walked slowly toward the instrument. The opulent dining room seemed to hold its breath as Deborah approached the gleaming grand piano. The soft, elegant glow of the chandelier above cast a theatrical spotlight directly upon her, isolating her from the murmuring crowd, making her the undeniable focal point. Her fingers, despite her fierce resolve, trembled slightly as she slid onto the polished bench, the ivory and ebony keys gleaming like a direct challenge, waiting to be conquered. Behind her, Leonard leaned back in his chair, the very embodiment of smug satisfaction, as though his victory in this cruel game was already assured. Deborah closed her eyes for a fleeting moment, steadying her ragged breath, attempting to quiet the frantic pounding of her heart. This was profoundly different from the comforting familiarity of a church recital or the cozy intimacy of community gatherings she had once known. This was hostile. This was public. But there was no retreat now. She carefully placed her hands on the cool, smooth surface of the keys. The very first notes were soft, hesitant, almost agonizingly fragile, barely audible above the lingering silence. A few diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and someone in the back cleared their throat. Deborah ignored them, her focus sharpening, intensifying, as she leaned into the nascent melody. She chose a piece she knew intimately, by heart, a soulful, ethereal rendition of Debussy's Clair de Lune. The melody, a delicate but unyielding thread, began to spill into the vast room, weaving itself through the hushed air. As her confidence, fueled by the familiar notes, gradually swelled, the music swelled with it. Her hands, once trembling, now moved with an almost mesmerizing grace that completely belied the emotional chaos raging within her. The notes poured out, raw and honest, like a confession. Each intricate chord seemed to carry a piece of her life's story. The profound sacrifices her mother had made, the solitary nights she had spent practicing in a cramped, tiny room, the crushing weight of aspirations deferred but, crucially, never entirely abandoned. The diners, initially curious, then skeptical, fell into a collective, profound silence. Their earlier chatter was replaced by a stillness so complete it was almost reverent. Even Leonard, who had been lazily whispering to his companions, went utterly quiet, his dismissive smirk slowly dissolving. Deborah didn't need to overtly look at him to keenly feel the undeniable shift in the room's energy. The mocking, condescending atmosphere had dissipated, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps awe, perhaps a dawning humility, or even grudging respect. The music soared, a pure, unadulterated expression of her being, and Deborah allowed herself to completely surrender to it. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't just a waitress, nor a struggling dreamer burdened by practicality. She was simply herself, an artist, unburdened, unfiltered. Her fingers danced across the keys, drawing out emotions so raw, so vivid they seemed to hang palpably in the air, like ethereal smoke. By the time she struck the final, lingering chord, the room was utterly, breathtakingly still. For a suspended moment there was no sound, only the lingering, resonant vibrations of the piano, a ghost of the melody hanging in the air. Deborah remained frozen, her hands still resting gently on the keys, unsure of what would come next. Then, as though released from a potent spell, the audience erupted into thunderous applause. The sound was deafening, reverberating off the elegant walls, filling the room with a warmth and sincerity Deborah hadn't dared to expect. Some diners, swept up in the emotion, stood, clapping with a fervor that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Her co-workers, who had been watching from the sidelines, their faces now alight with pride and admiration, joined in the ovation. Leonard, however, remained rigidly seated. His smirk was utterly gone, replaced by an expression Deborah couldn't quite decipher, part shock, part profound discomfort, a flicker of something akin to shame. He slowly raised his hands and clapped, a hesitant, hollow sound that was utterly swallowed by the genuine cheers surrounding him. But even his reluctant applause, a grudging acknowledgement, couldn't overshadow what Deborah had just achieved. She had not only played, she had reclaimed her voice, asserted her inherent worth. No amount of condescension, no arrogant display of wealth could ever take that away from her again. As the thunderous applause gradually began to fade, the room seemed to exhale collectively. a shared release of tension and awe. Deborah slowly stood, her knees still trembling slightly, but her back held ramrod straight, imbued with a newfound strength. She glanced around the dining room, and for the first time that evening, she truly saw the faces watching her, not as detached spectators, but as witnesses to something profound. Their expressions carried something new, unfeigned admiration, genuine respect, and even a hint of awe. She didn't immediately look at Leonard. Instead, she offered a small, polite nod to the diners who had clapped the loudest, her lips curving into a faint, gentle smile. It wasn't pride she felt, not exactly, but a deep, profound sense of relief. Relief that she hadn't succumbed to fear. Relief that she had allowed her talent to speak for itself. Then, as though drawn by an invisible force, her gaze finally shifted to Leonard. He was still rigidly seated, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. The confident smirk he'd worn so brazenly earlier was nowhere to be found. Instead, his face was a mask of forced neutrality, as though he couldn't quite decide whether to acknowledge his profound misstep or stubbornly double down on his arrogance. Well, Leonard finally said, his voice louder than it needed to be, abruptly breaking the fragile silence that had settled over the room. Surprise. That was unexpected. Hollow chuckle. He chuckled lightly, though the sound lacked its usual bravado. Hollow and unconvincing. Condescending. I suppose talent truly emerges from the most surprising origins. The remark landed like a dull thud, heavy with his lingering condescension. His companions exchanged awkward, uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to offer a nervous laugh or remain silently mortified. Deborah tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering, studying him. His words were clearly intended as an olive branch, a clumsy attempt at conciliation. But they were hollow, weighed down by his evident inability to truly own the moment, to genuinely acknowledge his error. Thank you, Deborah said, her tone steady and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but crucially, no lingering hostility either. She wasn't about to let him pull her back into the smallness he had tried so hard to impose. Her performance had spoken louder, more eloquently than any verbal rebuttal she could offer. Leonard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable under the unwavering scrutiny of the room's collective gaze. He gestured toward a passing waiter for another drink, a flimsy attempt to regain his lost composure. Grudgingly, "You've quite a gift," he added, almost begrudgingly, as if forcing the words out. Deborah nodded once, her gaze still unwavering. Deliberate. "Everyone possesses a gift," she said, the weight of her words deliberate, resonant. It's how one chooses to utilize it that truly matters. The room seemed to hold its breath once more, the subtle, profound sting of her response rippling through the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was enough. Leonard visibly shifted in his seat, his usual air of unassailable dominance slipping further with each passing second. The diners, sensing the resolution of the drama, slowly began to turn their attention back to their meals, though the entire energy in the room had irrevocably shifted. Where there had once been the quiet hum of self-important privilege and pretense, there was now something richer, something authentic, a shared understanding, perhaps even a quiet respect for the waitress who had so powerfully reminded everyone of the undeniable power of authenticity. Leonard wasn't just humiliated, he was exposed. And no amount of charm or bluster could shield him from the truth everyone in that room now perceived. Deborah stepped away from the piano, the profound weight of the moment settling deep in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement, their eyes reflecting a shared victory. As she returned to her station, something about her very posture had changed. Her head was held a little higher, her movements more deliberate, imbued with a quiet pride. Leonard's table had quieted considerably. His entourage, who had laughed so freely at her expense earlier, now actively avoided eye contact, their conversations subdued, almost furtive. The bravado that had once filled their corner of the restaurant had completely evaporated, leaving only an awkward, uncomfortable silence. The night continued its course, but Deborah felt lighter, almost buoyant. Each step she took through the dining room felt more purposeful, her confidence blooming in a way she hadn't expected. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, several patrons, some strangers, stopped her to offer sincere, kind words. "You're incredible," one older woman said softly as Deborah set down a coffee cup, her eyes shining. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving. Keep going." Another gentleman, his voice warm, added, "You've got something truly special. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." Deborah thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with profound gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were vital validations of everything she'd worked for, everything she'd quietly aspired to become. Leonard, however, was not so gracious. As Deborah approached his table to discreetly deliver the check, he looked up at her with an expression that teetered precariously between annoyance and a deeply reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his tone clipped, dismissive. "No need to emphasize it." Deborah paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice calm but firm, holding its ground. "I simply wanted to play." Leonard had no response. He fidgeted uncomfortably with his drink, his once commanding presence reduced to an awkward, almost pathetic shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, irrevocably, and everyone at the table, including Leonard himself, knew it. As Leonard scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a noticeably softer demeanor, looked up at Deborah. "You were amazing," he said, his voice genuinely earnest. "Truly." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of humanity in a group she had completely written off as shallow and superficial. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small, genuine smile before walking away. The night concluded with Leonard and his group leaving quietly, their usual grand, ostentatious exit replaced by a hasty, almost apologetic retreat. Deborah watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. Her mind was no longer occupied by Leonard or the night's conflict. Her thoughts were already on the next step. The tips from that evening were unusually generous, far more than usual, enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra for the long-postponed piano lessons. As she locked up the restaurant and walked home, the crisp night air filling her lungs, Deborah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Certainty. She wasn't just a waitress, nor was she just a dreamer. She was an artist. And nothing, not mocking words, not financial struggles, not even the insidious grip of fear, could ever take that away from her again. Her thoughts weren't on the past, they were on the future, where her dreams, finally, felt closer than ever before. Deborah sat on the worn bench in her small apartment, her fingers gliding gracefully over the keys of her old, upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music flowed effortlessly from her heart, just as it always had. That night something profound had shifted within her, not merely a moment of public triumph, but a deeply personal realization that her talent wasn't something she needed to conceal or justify. It was intrinsically hers, and it was simply enough. In the days that followed, the extraordinary events at the restaurant became something of a local legend. Patrons who had witnessed her impromptu performance enthusiastically shared the captivating tale, and word began to spread far beyond the confines of La Fontaine. A few days later, Deborah received an unexpected call from a man who had been dining that night, a music producer visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering instant fame or immense fortune, but a tangible chance to record a demo, a genuine step towards something she had only ever dared to dream of in her most private moments. Deborah readily agreed, not because she believed it would magically transform her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, a path appearing, one she was no longer afraid to walk through. For years, she had allowed fear and doubt to whisper insidious lies into her mind, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too grand, too unattainable. But now she saw the undeniable truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest, most potent strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson wasn't just a humiliating spectacle, miraculously transformed into a public victory. It was a profound, personal reminder of the indomitable power of integrity. Leonard, for all his immense wealth and arrogant bravado, possessed nothing that could truly diminish her. Not her spirit, not her talent. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, every external and internal critic, and she had silenced him, not with words, but with the pure, unadulterated power of her craft. To anyone observing her story, Deborah's message was crystalline and clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world she knew was full of Leonard Graysons, people who, driven by their own deep-seated insecurities, attempt to project their inadequacies onto others to feel powerful. But true power, she had learned, comes not from domination, but from staying deeply rooted in who you are, from letting your passions speak louder, more eloquently than any ridicule. As she gently closed the piano lid and rested her hands on the faded, warm wood, Deborah smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the very first time, it felt like it had truly, meaningfully begun.